There is a moment in the life of every authoritarian system when the mathematics of survival change so completely, so irreversibly, and so publicly that the system can no longer pretend the old calculations still apply. It is not always a single dramatic event. It is not always a battle lost, or a city fallen, or a leader killed. Sometimes it is a weekend. Sometimes it is 72 hours in which every assumption the regime built its strategy upon collapses simultaneously, in which the intelligence community of the world's most powerful nation cancels military leave and prepares strike packages and braces for the bombs that everyone expects to fall. And then, instead of bombs, a peace proposal leaks from inside the regime itself, carrying terms so concessive, so historically unprecedented, so nakedly desperate that the word surrender is not an exaggeration. It is the only accurate description available. That weekend just happened. And what came out of it? The leaked memorandum, the Iranian officials celebrating before the ink is dry, the White House going silent in ways that speak louder than any press release, the American senators erupting in fury, the Pakistani prime minister hosting negotiations while the world watches his city, is the story of a regime that spent 47 years telling its population it would never surrender to America, discovering, in the space of a single Memorial Day weekend, that surrender is the only card it has left to play. Let us begin with the hours before the deal. Because to understand the surrender, you have to understand the panic that preceded it. You have to understand what Washington looked like in the 72 hours before the Iranian officials started posting cryptic statements about Roman emperors and Persian victories. The first signal came from the White House itself. President Trump skipped a family wedding to remain in Washington. That detail alone, a president declining a family celebration to stay at his desk, communicates to anyone who follows these things that something significant is either happening or about to happen. Presidents do not skip weddings for routine diplomacy. They skip weddings when the intelligence on their desk is telling them that the next 72 hours will determine something that cannot be undetermined. Then came the report from CBS News confirming that United States service members were having their leaves canceled for the Memorial Day weekend. Military leave cancellations are not a subtle signal. They are the operational preparation for imminent military action. And every defense analyst, every intelligence watcher, every journalist who covers national security understood immediately what the cancellation meant. The United States was preparing to strike. Then the Pentagon confirmed it directly, in the way that the Pentagon confirms things it wants adversaries to hear, through anonymous officials speaking to reliable outlets. Strike packages were being prepared. The president was being given options. The military was ready. All that was required was the order. And then the intelligence broke about the assassination plot. An Iraqi national, a trained operative, a member of the IRGC's extended network, had been arrested after making a specific, documented operational pledge to kill Ivanka Trump. Not a general threat, not rhetorical bluster on a state media broadcast. A specific operative with a specific target, a blueprint of her Florida home, and a statement recorded and reported by the New York Post that cut to the heart of what the Islamic Republic had been reduced to as a strategic actor. We need to kill Ivanka to burn down the house of Trump the way he burned down our house. That statement, that specific operationally serious, personally targeted assassination plot, is the statement of a regime acting not from strategic calculation, but from grief and desperation, and the primitive political logic of retaliation that has no endpoint and no strategic benefit and no outcome that improves the regime's position in any measurable way. It is the statement of a regime that has lost the ability to think strategically and is now operating on pure reactive emotion. The world was bracing for bombs. The military leave was canceled. The strike packages were ready. The intelligence about the assassination plot had given the Trump administration both the justification and the domestic political momentum for a massive bombing campaign that public opinion would have supported overwhelmingly. And then, instead of bombs, a peace proposal leaked. The leak came from 3 Iranian officials, not from the White House, not from a neutral mediator, from inside the regime itself. And that origin, the fact that the terms of Iran's surrender were first disclosed to the world by Iranian officials rather than American ones, tells you everything you need to know about the strategic logic driving the regime's behavior in this moment. Iran wanted to control the narrative. Iran wanted to be the entity that framed the terms of the deal, that presented the concessions in the most favorable possible light, that managed the story for the domestic audience that had spent 2 months watching its country get bombed, its currency collapse further, its food prices rise another 20%, its supreme leader disappear into an AI-generated ghost. The White House went quiet, not accidentally. Not because the administration was caught off guard. The White House went quiet because it understood that letting Iran frame the narrative in the short term was a manageable cost, if the alternative was watching the deal collapse, because the IRGC hardliners who oppose any negotiation used American triumphalism as the justification for torpedoing the framework. So Iran talked. And the terms it described, the terms that 3 Iranian officials leaked to control the story, were simultaneously the most significant diplomatic development in the Middle East in a generation, and a masterclass in how a losing party presents its defeat as something other than what it is. According to those 3 Iranian officials, Iran had agreed to a memorandum of understanding that would halt all fighting, including in Lebanon, reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and allow commercial traffic to flow freely without Iran charging a transit fee. In return, the United States would lift its naval blockade. $25 billion in frozen Iranian assets would be released to the Islamic Republic. And the nuclear question, the entire reason the war started, the entire strategic objective around which Operation Epic Fury was built, the question of Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile and its weapons-grade enrichment program, would be pushed back to a follow-up negotiation taking place within 30 to 60 days after the Memorandum of Understanding was signed. Those were the terms Iran described. And if those terms were the complete story, they would represent something close to the terms that the losing side always tries to negotiate. Stop the immediate bleeding, release the frozen. Money, defer the hardest concession to a future conversation that may never happen. Iran was describing a deal in which it gave up control of the Strait of Hormuz, which it had already effectively lost, and deferred the nuclear question to a future negotiation, while receiving $25 billion in sanctions relief in return. That framing, that presentation of the deal, is why Iranian officials were celebrating publicly and immediately, posting statements about Roman emperors learning to negotiate peace, on Persian terms, sending the domestic audience the message that the resistance had produced results, that the concessions were manageable, that the Islamic Republic had survived. Then the American side spoke, not officially, not through a named spokesperson standing at a podium, through the mechanism the White House uses when it wants something known without being formally attributed, an anonymous official speaking to the New York Times, the same outlet that had published the Iranian conditions. And what the American anonymous official said changed the entire story. The United States confirmed that one element of the proposed agreement is an apparent commitment by Iran to give up its stockpile of highly enriched uranium. Not defer the discussion, not agree to negotiate about it later, give it up, surrender the stockpile. The officials acknowledged that the proposal does not yet settle precisely how Iran would dispose of the uranium, the logistics, the verification mechanisms, the timeline, but the general commitment in writing, Iran's agreement to surrender the uranium, was reportedly in the framework. That single detail, buried in the American anonymous readout, absent from the Iranian official celebration posts, is the detail that transforms the entire nature of what happened this weekend. Iran was not describing a deal in which it gave up the strait it had already lost and deferred the hardest question. Iran was describing a deal in which it gave up the strait it had already lost while quietly agreeing to surrender its highly enriched uranium stockpile in a written commitment that it was desperately hoping its own domestic audience would not notice. The reason Iran did not want that detail public is documented and specific. The last time Iran was close to agreeing to surrender its enriched uranium, approximately 1 month earlier in the previous round of negotiations, there were literal street protests from pro-IRGC forces and regime supporters in Tehran. The people who support the regime, the people who are bused to the allegiance rallies, and who have built their political identity around the Islamic Republic's defiance of America, did not want their government to give up the uranium. The uranium was the symbol. The uranium was the proof that 47 years of resistance had produced something real, something irreversible, something that gave Iran a strategic card that no amount of American military pressure could simply take away. Surrendering the uranium is not just a diplomatic concession. It is the symbolic dismantling of the resistance narrative. It is the regime telling its own supporters that the thing they were promised, the thing they sacrificed for, the thing the dead were said to have died for, was negotiable all along. The regime wanted to give up the uranium quietly, in fine print, in a follow-up negotiation, hidden inside a framework that it could present to the domestic audience as a Persian victory over Roman imperial ambition. The American side made sure the world knew the commitment was already in the framework. Both accounts cannot be simultaneously true. Either Iran has already committed in writing to surrendering its highly enriched uranium, which is what American officials say, or the uranium question is genuinely deferred, which is what Iranian officials say. Someone is managing the narrative. And the question of who is lying and why has implications that extend far beyond the immediate deal. If Iran is lying to its domestic audience, presenting a uranium surrender as a deferred discussion to avoid the street protests that a public admission would trigger, that is manageable from the American perspective. The commitment is in writing. The domestic Iranian presentation of it is a political problem for Tehran, not Washington. The deal probably works. But if American officials are overstating what Iran has agreed to in order to present the administration's diplomacy as more successful than it actually is, if the uranium commitment is softer, more conditional, more provisional than the anonymous White House readout suggests, then the implications are severe, not just domestically, with midterm elections approaching and a Republican caucus that includes senators calling the deal a disaster, but internationally, among the allies who depend on American security guarantees and who are watching very carefully to determine whether American commitments mean what American officials say they mean. The American political reaction was immediate, furious, and deeply revealing about the fractures inside Washington's own Iran policy consensus. Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State who oversaw the maximum pressure campaign during the first Trump administration, stated publicly and unambiguously that if the leaked terms were real, then the United States should simply restart the war immediately. His position was stark. There is no point in giving up everything the United States has achieved through Operation Epic Fury in exchange for terms that leave Iran's nuclear program essentially intact and reward the regime with $25 billion in sanctions relief after everything it has done. Senator Roger Wicker, the senior Republican voice on the Armed Services Committee, called the deal a disaster that would undo everything accomplished during Operation Epic Fury. Senator Lindsey Graham said the same. Senator Ted Cruz echoed the message. These are not fringe voices. These are the senior Republican senators with the deepest institutional knowledge of the United States military and its strategic objectives in the Middle East. They were publicly, loudly, on the record, telling the Trump administration that the deal being described from Tehran was unacceptable, that it represented a strategic failure of the First Order, that the United States had used its full military and economic power to create the conditions for a genuinely transformative agreement with Iran, and was now apparently preparing to accept something far less than what that power had made achievable. The senators acknowledged that they were operating from the same leaked information that journalists and the public were seeing, that the real terms might be different, more demanding, more favorable to American interests than the Iranian presentation suggested. But their public statements served a specific purpose regardless of whether the details were complete. They were pressure. They were the institutional voice of American hawkishness, telling the Trump administration publicly that any deal that did not permanently and verifiably eliminate Iran's nuclear capability, dismantle the IRGC's proxy network infrastructure, and produce meaningful accountability for 47 years of Iranian-sponsored terrorism would be treated as a capitulation rather than a victory. The political cost of that framing, of having the senior Republican foreign policy establishment describe the president's diplomatic achievement as a disaster, is not trivial. It creates the domestic political conditions that could force the administration to demand harder terms in the follow-up negotiations than Iran is currently prepared to offer. And it signals to Iran that whatever it agreed to in the Memorandum of Understanding framework, the American political system will be watching the follow-up negotiations with a scrutiny that makes the soft uranium commitments Iran is hoping to maintain very difficult to sustain. The Gulf states deserve specific attention in this story because their role in pushing for the deal reveals something important about the regional stakes that are driving every actor's calculations. The New York Times and Wall Street Journal both confirmed that Gulf leaders, specifically from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, were actively pressing Washington to finalize some form of agreement. The Gulf states were pushing for peace, not because they support the Iranian regime. They were pushing for peace because they had spent 2 months watching intercepted missiles rain down on their infrastructure, drone strikes target their industrial facilities, and their oil infrastructure set ablaze by the conflict. The Strait of Hormuz, through which a significant portion of the world's oil supply transits, had been functionally disrupted by the Iranian blockade and counter-blockade dynamics of the conflict. Every day the strait remained closed was a day that Gulf oil revenues were constrained, that global energy markets remained in the kind of volatile uncertainty that makes long-term infrastructure investment impossible, that the economic integration projects the Gulf states have spent years building continue to be disrupted by a conflict they did not start and cannot control. Saudi Arabia, which has spent the past several years building an economic diversification strategy under Vision 2030 that requires regional stability as its foundation, cannot afford a permanently militarized Gulf. The UAE, which has built Dubai into one of the world's most important commercial and financial hubs on the premise of reliable regional connectivity, cannot afford a permanently closed strait. Qatar, which hosts the American military installations that have been central to the conflict's execution, was navigating the impossible position of hosting the military power, destroying its neighbor while trying to maintain the commercial relationships with both sides that its economic model requires. The Gulf states wanted the deal because the alternative, An open-ended military conflict with no defined endpoint, sustained U.S.-Iran hostility that periodically erupts into missile exchanges and infrastructure strikes, is existentially incompatible with the economic futures they are trying to build. Their pressure on Washington was not ideological. It was commercial and strategic to self-interest, expressed through the diplomatic channels they have spent years cultivating precisely for moments like this one. Pakistan's role in this story is simultaneously important and revealing of its own limitations. The Pakistani Prime Minister's statement confirmed that negotiations were ongoing, that President Trump had made extraordinary efforts to pursue peace, and that Pakistan would continue its mediation role and hoped to host the next round of talks. The statement was careful, diplomatically worded, and notably absent of any confirmation that a deal had been reached, which functionally contradicted the triumphant tone of the Iranian officials who had been celebrating on social media while Pakistan's mediator was quietly telling the world that nothing was finalized. Pakistan wanted the attention that hosting historic negotiations brings. When the previous round of talks took place in Islamabad, the whole world was watching the city, and there are observers who note that Pakistani officials seem as motivated by the diplomatic prestige of being the venue as by the substantive outcome of the negotiations. That is not a fatal flaw in a mediator. Prestige, motivations can be aligned with substantive success. Pakistan gets the attention it wants if the talks succeed, which gives it incentive to push both sides toward agreement. But the concern that analysts and American officials have raised about Pakistan's mediating role is more specific and more serious than mere prestige seeking. The concern is that Pakistan not become what Oman was before the war started, a channel that Iran used not to conduct genuine negotiations, but to manage the American diplomatic posture, to create the appearance of engagement, while the IRGC continued building the nuclear and proxy capabilities that the engagement was supposed to address. The distinction between a genuine mediator and an Iranian diplomatic management tool is the distinction that determines whether the follow-up negotiations that the Memorandum of Understanding framework points toward are real or theatrical. And given that the nuclear question, the entire reason for the war, has been deferred to those follow-up negotiations, the quality of Pakistan's mediation is not an abstract diplomatics. Now let us talk about what the Iranian population actually experienced during this weekend, because the gap between the regime's narrative, the Persian victory over Roman imperialism, the deal on Iranian terms, the resistance that produced results, and the lived reality of ordinary Iranians is so wide that it constitutes its own form of political crisis for a regime that is trying to present surrender as success. The currency is at 1.44 million rials to the dollar. The dairy prices are going up 20% from June 1st. The food price inflation is running at 72% annually. The protests that began December 28, 2025, are still active across 675 locations in all 31 provinces. The nighttime anti-Khamenei chants are still echoing off apartment buildings in a dozen cities. The supreme leader is still in calm, still communicating through AI-generated videos, still absent from public life in every meaningful sense. And into this environment, the regime is trying to sell a peace deal as a victory. The Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson posted a statement with a historical reference to Persian victories over Iranian adversary being defeated in a war set in 2060 AD, while the text referenced a negotiated settlement from a different historical period entirely, sending simultaneously the message of military victory and diplomatic negotiation, a contradiction so obvious that Iranians with access to Telegram and the historical record could parse it immediately. The regime needs the deal to look like victory because the alternative, the accurate description, which is that Iran is surrendering its highly enriched uranium stockpile, or reopening the strait it closed, halting the proxy campaigns across Lebanon and Yemen and Iraq, and accepting an American security framework that leaves the IRGC fundamentally constrained, is a description that makes the 47 years of sacrifice make no sense. If the deal that ends the confrontation with America looks like what the American anonymous official described, then every sanction endured, every executed dissident, every arrested journalist, every killed protester, every depreciated real, every food price increase, every mandatory hijab enforcement, every internet shutdown was the cost of eventually arriving at the same place Iran could have been in 2015 if it had honored the nuclear deal instead of watching the IRGC sabotage it. The Iranian population understands this arithmetic. The taxi driver who told Al Jazeera that dairy prices rose 6 times in a year understands it. The merchant in the Grand Bazaar who pulled down his shutters and joined the protests understands it. The families of the 36 to 45 people killed in the December protests understand it. The regime is trying to sell a narrative of Persian victory to a population that can see the price of eggs and knows what their currency is worth and has watched their supreme leader disappear into AI-generated video for 6 weeks. The narrative is not selling. There's a dimension of this surrender story that has received almost no attention, but which may prove to be its most significant long-term consequence. The assassination plot against Ivanka Trump, the IRGC-connected operative with the blueprint of her Florida home and the recorded pledge to burn down the house of Trump the way Trump burned down their house, arrived at exactly the moment when the regime was simultaneously trying to negotiate a peace deal. Think about what that simultaneity reveals about the actual coherence of Iranian decision-making in May 2026. One part of the Iranian system, the faction oriented toward the civilian government and the pragmatists who understand that the only path forward involves a deal with the United States, is negotiating, leaking terms, posting Persian victory statements, trying to manage the narrative of a surrender into something the domestic audience can tolerate. Another part of the Iranian system, the IRGC hardliners, the faction that has been trading physical threats in parliamentary sessions over the ceasefire, the faction that publicly declared through Hamid Rasai that signing any ceasefire simply invites new strikes, is simultaneously running assassination plots against the American president's family members. These are not two different countries. They are two factions of the same government operating simultaneously in direct contradiction of each other in ways that reveal the depth of the fracturing that Trump accurately described when he said Iran's government is seriously fractured. The assassination plot did not derail the deal. The Trump administration, with military leave canceled and strike packages prepared, apparently decided that the surrender framework being offered was more strategically valuable than another round of bombing. But the plot's existence, its operational specificity, its personal targeting of the president's family, its grounding in the 2019 Soleimani assassination as the grievance that motivated it, tells you everything about the IRGC hardliners' actual strategic posture. They are not participating in the surrender. They are not endorsing the Memorandum of Understanding. They are running assassination operations against American civilians, while their government's civilian faction posts Roman history references on social media and tells the world that a deal is done. That internal contradiction between the faction surrendering and the faction still fighting is the variable that makes every analyst who takes the deal seriously also take the deal's fragility seriously. You cannot have a durable peace agreement with a government that is simultaneously negotiating peace and plotting assassinations. The question of whether the IRGC hardliners are brought into the framework or marginalized by it, or simply removed from the equation through the combination of the deal's constraints and the domestic political dynamics that the deal will set in motion, that question is the question that determines whether the Memorandum of Understanding becomes the historic agreement that ends the confrontation, or becomes another entry in the long list of Iranian diplomatic frameworks that dissolved when the IRGC decided it was not bound by what the civilian government had agreed to. The ghost supreme leader problem sits at the center of everything, because any deal that Iran signs, any commitment Iran makes in writing, any framework Iran agrees to, requires constitutional ratification by the supreme leader. And that is how the Islamic Republic's decision-making architecture works. The supreme leader's authority is the foundation that makes any institutional commitment binding. Without his active, functional endorsement, every Iranian signature on every document is provisional in the specific sense that the one person constitutionally required to make it permanent has not made it permanent. Mojtaba Khamenei has not appeared in public since his designation on March 8, 2026. He is in Qom, receiving medical treatment according to a diplomatic memo obtained by the Times of London. He is described by Israeli intelligence sources as an empty entity who does not control or lead the regime. He is producing AI-generated videos that Iranians are openly mocking on Telegram. He is constitutionally required to provide the authority that makes the peace deal real, and he is functionally absent from the decision-making process that produced it. This creates the specific nightmare scenario that the American senators and former officials are warning about. Iran signs the Memorandum of Understanding. Iran accepts the framework. The blockade is lifted. The $25 billion is released. Commercial traffic flows through the Strait of Hormuz. And then, in the follow-up negotiations 30 to 60 days later, when the uranium question has to be resolved specifically and verifiably, the IRGC hardliners produce a new supreme leader ruling, possibly genuine, possibly manufactured, possibly extracted from Mojtaba Khamenei under conditions no one outside his immediate circle can verify. That reinterprets the uranium commitment in ways that make it unverifiable or unenforceable. That is the trap that Mike Pompeo and Roger Wicker and Lindsey Graham are warning about. Not that the deal is bad on its face, but that a deal signed by a government this fractured, anchored to a supreme leader this absent, with IRGC factions still running assassination plots and trading parliamentary threats, is a deal that the American military pressure made possible, but that the American diplomatic framework may not be able to make permanent. Here's where this stands as of the final days of May 2026. The Memorandum of Understanding framework exists. 3 Iranian officials have confirmed its broad outlines. American anonymous officials have confirmed that a uranium surrender commitment is in the framework. Gulf states are pushing for finalization. Pakistan is offering Islamabad as the venue for the next round of talks. Trump has confirmed on Truth Social that an agreement has been largely negotiated subject to finalization, using the formal language Islamic Republic of Iran in a way that his own team noted was unprecedented. The military leave that was canceled for Memorial Day weekend has presumably been reinstated, at least temporarily, suggesting that the immediate bombing campaign was stood down in favor of the diplomatic framework. The Iranian Foreign Ministry is celebrating on social media with Roman history references while hoping its domestic audience does not notice the uranium commitment buried in the American readout. The IRGC hardliners are furious, publicly in parliamentary sessions, warning that any deal simply invites new strikes in the autumn. And the Supreme Leader is calm in medical treatment, processing AI-generated video addresses to his population, constitutionally required to ratify an agreement that the factions of his ting and threatening to sabotage. The panic is real. The surrender is real. The fragility of what has been agreed to is also real. And the summer that is coming, with its 40-degree temperatures and power cuts and dairy price increases and 675 protest locations and nighttime anti-Khamenei chants, will determine whether the surrender framework holds or whether it becomes the latest entry in the long register of Iranian diplomatic promises that turned out to mean something different from what the words said. The regime panicked. The regime issued its surrender. Whether the surrender sticks is the story that is still being written. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We will be right here when the next chapter lands. See you in the next one.